Well, those elections were very violent, but the people resisted. This is the Western region of the time. I was then teaching at the University of Ibadan. They were violent, and the incumbent government used its power of incumbency in the region in alliance with the power at the center. It was a federal structure. Then came in spite of that, they could not rig the election successfully. And so what they did was just start altering the results. And even that proved exceedingly difficult for them. Finally, the premier of the region decided to just forget the whole thing and announce his victory on radio. And I happened, by very fortunate coincidence, I learned that this was going to become a fait accompli. And since he had the support of the federal government, something drastic had to be done. And so, with some assistance, some of my usual collaborators, I managed to stop the broadcast, substitute I pre-recorded my own statement. So I went to the studio and I took the Prime Minister, the Premier's tape off and substituted my own and went away. And so I was tried, very, very nasty charge. I was charged with armed robbery because apparently this event was supposed to have taken place with the aid of a gun. And so very cunning people, coming to frame, charge of armed robbery. A tape, cost under £1 or whatever. And I substituted one anyway. So it wasn't, and I left that one. So where was the robbery? Anyway, I was tried and acquitted, thank goodness. And then some years passed. Of course, the seeds of what came later were already being planted from that the rigging of the elections in the West and in the rest of the country, as a matter of fact. And so a military coup took place this is 1966 in January. There were massacres, especially against the Igbos, because the first coup, the leaders were mostly Igbo, and so reprisal killings took place, and the drums of war began to sound very, very loud. The East, Igbos who felt they had been, really violated because they were hunted down all over the place, not just in the North. They decided to secede. My friend Christopher Kibo was Igbo, of course. We formed a artist community in Ibadan. He was a founding member of the Mbari, and we were quite close. When I was detained for that armed robbery episode, he used to come and visit me in my place of detention. I was not actually formally detained. I was just not granted bail, that's all. And so he used to come and visit me at the police cell where I was held, police station, and we'd read his poetry together, or more accurately, he would read his poetry. He loved reading his own poems. He wanted you to hear exactly how it sounded, because he was very oral, musical kind of poet. He was a musician also, by the way, so that wasn't surprising. And so we became quite close. And when when I realized that war really was going to, happen, I tried to, and he'd left, like the other Igbo that fled to the east, where they were more secure. Chinua Achebe was in the east. We had other writers like Gabriel Okara in the east. And I felt maybe by linking up and resurrecting that tight community, we might be able to do something to prevent that war. And so I traveled. By then, the firing had started. The early skirmishes had begun. And I traveled by road to the east. I was promptly arrested as a suspected enemy by the Biafrans whom I had come to see. But of course, sometime after the police realized who I was and I was released, and who would come into my police station. He didn't know I was there. It was Christopher Kibu coming from the war front, coming for more equipment. And so we were reunited for the last time. Okay, he went back to the war front, and I saw the leader of the secessionist enclave, Juku. We spoke. And then when I came back, I was detained for having traveled to the east. I was accused of all kinds of things, including trying to buy jet fighters for I don't know why people like to cook, fantasies around one's individual existence. I belong to the West, the Yoruba, part of the Federation. And when a war is being fought, it's being fought on behalf of people. And this war committed me, as a Nigerian, it committed me, and I felt that war was wrong. And I refused to accept that, to be committed in that way. The Biafrans had been violated. They had been massacred. There's more than one massacre. It was like a wave of massacres. And they were being hunted everywhere. In other words, the conduct of the federal side, at least that portion to which I belong, indicated said in plain language, even though it was not articulated as such, you, the Igbo, are no longer part of the Federation. There was nothing was done to make them feel secure. At least not enough was done to make them feel secure in the rest of the nation. And then after they had seceded, which I considered, by the way, a tactical mistake, not a political crime, not a moral crime, no. But it was a tactical error. And, but then to go after them, to declare war against them on this banal basis of unity above anything else. Unity of what? I mean, who committed the act of disuniting the nation in the first place? Those who made the Igbo feel they were not part of the full entity. So for me, it was an unjust war of which I could not be a part. And if I had not gone to the East, I would have gone into exile, because I would refuse to be part of that entity which waged war against a people who had been so dehumanized. So in effect, it was for my own peace of mind to try and do everything possible to make sure the war did not take place. There was supposed to be a delegation going from the federal side, a delegation of citizens, high-placed citizens, traditional rulers, and so on. And I wanted to make sure that when they went over to the East, they didn't go mouthing pious, meaningless sentiments. They should understand that they were going to visit wronged people, and that they should take the kind of message there that would make them come back. Well, as I expected, it was a futile visitation. The Igbo by that stage didn't trust anyone. And in any case, they had nothing concrete to take over to the other side. And so I followed up my letter by visiting there and trying to get Chinua, Christopher, the group I knew, and also talk to Juku, whom I'd known, the head of the Biafran enclave, whom I'd known, we're both students around the same time, even though he was somewhat older than myself. And when I came back, I brought back certain messages and delivered those messages on return. First of all, I was held in Lagos prison, maximum security prison in Lagos. And when I smuggled out that statement, denying all the charges and insisting that I be tried, the government panicked and decided to move me to Kaduna and place me in complete solitary confinement. I was shocked. It was one of the most bitterest moments of my incarceration to find the Minister of Information calling an international press conference and reading what was supposed to be my confession. It's one of the most horrible things that can happen to anybody in prison. That you feel, what else? What is going to come next? What are they going to say next? What are they, speaking in my name, reading, not even accusing me. I mean, that's okay. But actually saying, I have here his confessional statement. And every bit of it, except the trip to Biafra, a complete fabrication. But after I got to Kaduna, so I stayed completely quiet for some time, didn't even attempt to reach the outside world, just made sure they thought I was a complete model prisoner, totally resigned to be in isolation. And I began to probe the chinks and managed to start getting things outside, even sent some poems for publication to my publisher outside, which I'd scribbled on toilet paper with ink I'd manufactured and so on. I began writing, scribbling notes, in prison, but it wasn't actually published until after I'd come out. Writing became a therapy. First of all, it meant I was reconstructing my own existence. It was also an act of defiance because I wasn't supposed to write. I wasn't supposed to have paper, pen, anything, any reading material whatsoever. So this became an exercise in self-preservation, keeping up my spirits. It also, and you had to occupy very long hours of the day, not speaking to anyone. And I even, it wasn't just writing, I evolved all kinds of mental exercises, even went back to those subjects which I said I hated in school, in particular mathematics. Started to try and recover mathematical formula by trial and error, and then created problems for myself, which I solved. Anything to keep the mind alive. Because, as I said, it's an exercise in self-preservation. Writing was just part of it. My case never went to court. I knew they were never going to. Once I was taken from Lagos to Kaduna and placed in solitary confinement, I knew that I would never be tried. No, there was just no, and I think they were sharp enough to realize that if I was charged before court, it would just be a platform for me to express my views about the war. So I knew I'd never be charged to court. So all I did was write, communicate. It was breaking through that isolation was mostly for other people, not for myself, just to make those who were anxious on the outside know that I was okay. First of all, the war was coming to an end. This was allied to international pressure. So the government felt they can now afford to yield to some international pressure. I think it is a combination of those two. The federal government had become very self-confident. The international community, apart from France, maybe Tanzania, had swung behind the federal government. And of course, war is always won, both on the battlefield and on the opinion, field. So they felt they had nothing to worry about. I could shout myself hoarse. It didn't matter. They'd got what they wanted. And so they could afford to make this magnanimous gesture of releasing me. And when I came out, I tried to go back to normal life, but I knew I wasn't going to be very comfortable for long. There was a triumphalist atmosphere on the federal side, which I found very grating. And so I quietly made up my mind that I would go into self-exile at the first opportunity. I've never really ever gone into complete exile. In other words, I've never succeeded in cutting off, my environment. And I kept in touch with people at home, of course, and I got the news all the time, the misbehavior of the military, especially because we were now under full military dictatorship. And I took an interest in particular in one young man who had been brutalized by the military at a social occasion, to the extent that he had to have an amputation. And I was following that case and working with others within Nigeria, to make sure that he got his dues. The people involved were punished. One of them was a governor of one of these regions. And then I got a telegram one day which said the man died. He died from his wounds. And so I use that as an expression of the title. That's the title of the book. Something which I discovered when I came out of prison, some time after I came out of prison, was that Gowon was obviously an inexperienced young officer who was thrust into this position. He relied, as many leaders unfortunately do, on the kind of information he's given by his security agencies. Ultimately, the responsibility, of course, is his, because he signs the papers. But you discover when you investigate, when you analyze, all these situations, you find that the man at the head actually is probably the least knowledgeable about many things which transpired during his incumbency. And the first indication, in fact, by the time Gowon began to seek me out, I had already come to my own conclusions. I'd already made my own inquiries. I wasn't inquiring about myself so much, but about that whole period. And I knew what was going on. I'd seen documents. One always exists within a certain network. And it's in documents and things. So I know exactly what happened, how all these lies came to be told. So I had nothing against him personally. And then on top of that, he made attempts. He asked one of our ambassadors, when I was passing through England, asked him if he could arrange for us to meet, that he would like, us to meet. And I said I had no objection. Unfortunately, we didn't really get round to meeting. He tried to arrange dinner, because I was away when Gowon was in England, and we missed each other. And I knew sooner or later we were going to meet. Then, on top of that, a certain massacre, which in fact made me so bitter about the conduct of that government during the Civil War, and which I blamed on Gowon. The massacre took place in what is now the state of Benin, and in which innocents were lined up, men, women, children were gunned down, in cold blood. I learned about that. I wrote about it. And Gowon, I discovered, did not know anything about it. And when he learned about it later, he actually paid a visit to that place to apologize to the people of Benin. He met the Asagba of Asagba, that's a traditional ruler, who met him in council. And he was received, by the citizens and so on, because by then, the very fact that he came there to apologize made a great impression on him. So there was never, up to a certain point, any personal thing, my holding him personally responsible, ceased not long after I came out of prison, when I began my inquiries into the conduct of the Civil War. And many things which I placed on his side. And he apologized to me personally, and when he did, I told him, listen, you don't have to apologize to me. You've apologized to people already. I'm not, it's nothing at all. And so we're friends. even came to my birthday. I invited him. There was a banquet which was thrown and by the governor of my state, and also another governor on my 70th birthday. He was one of my. He topped. He was in the first rank of the guests whom I said must be invited. I began sketching out the first few chapters on toilet paper and some lines in between books. And it's a very strange thing about recollection. When I came out of prison and decided, and then some time later I said, well, I think I'm ready now to write. No, let me go back a little bit. I began looking for my notes, the chapters I'd written, in prison. Somehow they disappeared for some time because I had to smuggle the books out between whose lines I'd written some things. And so getting them back together took a while, and I could not find the documents, the things. And then one day, anyway, everything came back, and I began writing Ake, The Years of Childhood. In other words, the project had always been there. I'd always wanted to capture that period. And so I wrote Ake. And the interesting thing was that I later recovered my notes. And almost word for word, the 3 chapters I'd written when I was in prison tallied with new chapters in Ake. That's just an interesting footnote about the powers of memory. I mean, virtually line by line. Of course, some changes here and there. But it was amazing how the recollection can, total recall, about 3 chapters, just like in the notes in Ake. I was born in Abeokuta, Western Nigeria. It's a Yoruba town. I come from the Yoruba stock. And when I was born, it was still under colonial rule from the whole of Nigeria, of course. So it was an interesting mixture of, first of all, the traditional way of life, the traditions of the Yoruba people, but at the same time, the Christianized aspect of existence. You had the church. I grew up with knowing the pastor, the catechist, and at the same time being very conscious of the traditional religious people, their processions through town. I grew up in an atmosphere of political contestation because Nigeria, well, like most colonial places, was busy trying to decolonize, to free itself from British rule. So there was the polemics of nationalism and at the same time the regular rhythm of existence was captured in the cultures and so on. Home life was a very disciplined one. I grew up under parents who believed very literally in that expression, spare the rod and spoil the child. So it was very disciplined, and at the same time, it was an atmosphere of great exploration. In other words, despite the discipline, one was able to go out on one's own and discover things for oneself. My father was a school teacher. In fact, he was a headmaster in the primary school, believed passionately in education. My mother was a sort of petty trader, small items, cloths, a bit of jewelry, some foodstuffs, some, locally manufactured material. She traveled quite a bit. She was also, I used to call her a lieutenant, a political lieutenant of a very feisty, politically astute auntie of mine called Mrs. Ransom Kuti, who once led a revolt of the women against the traditional ruler, the Alaki of Abeokuta, who was imposing some unfair taxation on women's goods, and so that led to some fracas. So I grew up in this really, really exciting atmosphere of politics, real political activism on the one hand, and then there are more, shall we say, staid political discussions which went on around my father. He was sort of the center of a small, lower middle class intellectuals who would debate everything from the World War, going on at the time, to the price of newly introduced motorcycles in the area. One thing we were taught as children was the ethos of absolute equality, especially among children. My parents, as I used to say, used to collect waifs and strays, so we had a large family. I mean, some of them were relations, poorer than we were. And the people, their parents would come and virtually, donate the child. They say, look, help me educate this child, or this child is giving me too much trouble. Can he or she undergo some discipline here? Or maybe their parents were going away somewhere. Maybe they worked with the railway. Because if you were in the civil service, certain departments of the civil service, you were likely to be transferred anywhere, anytime. If you were a teacher also, with some missionary schools, you could be transferred. There was sort of physical, geographical mobility among many employees at the time, and traders, also people working for private commercial companies. You could get sent if, for instance, you were if you work for a cocoa exporting firm, you could be sent to the interior for some time. And some of these parents would bring their children to us. So the population of our household was constantly shifting, and they came from different strata of society. And so we were taught, not so much directly, but through the attitude of our parents to all the children, that there was no privilege, that everybody was a child, and if you misbehaved, you got just as much punishment as the other children. So if anything, in fact, we were treated even more harshly than the other children, because we were supposed to know better and to show an example. So I'm afraid the status, any kind of status, was to my disadvantage as a child. I was, from childhood, a voracious reader. I mean, I was really considered, and in hindsight, I think really I was a precocious reader. And it's wrong to say I virtually taught myself to read, but I know that I began picking out words before I actually went to school. And I had a sister who was only a year and 2 months, a year and 3 months, 3 months older than I was. And when she began school, she made my life miserable because she put on her school uniform and sort of looked at me with a kind of condescension, say, I'm going to school, you have to stay behind. It was infuriating. And so one day, and then of course, we lived in a parsonage, and which meant that there were some schools, missionary schools, sort of whose playgrounds abutted the lawn in front of our house. So I would watch these school kids also coming out during their break to play. And then I could see also through the schoolroom windows, not far from us, these pupils bent over their books and their papers. I mean, it was like a conspiracy. So one day I'd had enough, and I followed my sister to school. I picked up books from my father's desk. For me, it was the most natural thing. If you're going to school, you had to have books. So I picked up my father's books, which I couldn't read. And the next thing my sister knew was that I was behind her going into school. And even she was still too young to go to school by herself. So one of the older child relations used to take her to school. And when they turned around, they saw me. She screamed at me, "What are you doing here? What do you want? Go back." I said, "No, today, school day." So the school teacher, I remember, Mr. Olagbaju, came out to see what the fracas was all about. And he looked at me and I said, "But Wole, you're not yet old enough to come to school." And I said, "Oh, I'm ready." And just he decided to indulge me, felt I would get fed up with it after the first day. But no. So I actually began school at 2.5 years of age. The early influence in my life, I think, was my father. That's the earliest influence. He and his circle of friends. I was usually in our society, children are supposed to be neither seen nor heard. When elders are around, they're supposed to, very respectfully leave them alone. But I was curious. I just loved their debates. They used to get excited over issues, and so somehow I was allowed to eavesdrop, unlike the other children. And I picked up some of the ideas which they had, and I would ask questions. I was known as the questioner. And afterwards I would ask questions, and my father would indulge me by trying to explain things to me. And so that's one of the reasons I consider him the earliest influence. And also he had a small library, and I used to go into his library and try and read the books which I found there. And later on, as my circle of adult acquaintances increased, I think the next influence on me was my uncle, the Reverend I.O. Ransom Kuti, who was another very erudite person, a great educationist. And I used to visit them in Igbe, where he lived with his wife, and they ran a school. So on weekends, sometimes I would go there. And of course, it was the usual story. I wanted to listen to them discussing and so on. Don't misunderstand me. I was also very playful. I loved, disappearing by myself, climbing trees, all that I did, But additionally, I was just fascinated by the whole discourse, the exchange of ideas between adults. It just used to fascinate me for some reason. I was never tired of listening to them. So my uncle was my next great influence. Oh, I just picked out books. I didn't anything at all. I read catalogs. I read the newspaper, Akedeco. I read, among the books, I remember reading the bowdlerized versions of Charles Dickens, Olive Twist, which is the other one, which there was a Tale of Two Cities, I remember. One or two others, my favorites. And they were not the full editions, these are bowdlerized versions, and also some plays. I remember I came early in contact with Euripides, and I remember the exact play, it was the Medea. And I can't say that I fully grasped it, but I certainly read it. I was very fascinated. Of course, the Bible was always there. I found the Bible a wonderful piece of literature. I was never a very religious person, even in childhood. So I read that as well. It wasn't it wasn't an eclectic kind of program, but they were sufficiently varied to be of permanent interest to a young child. First, we had to go to church every Sunday morning, morning and evening on Sundays. Then there was Sunday school. The various seasons were observed, Easter, Christmas. I enjoyed those seasons. Anything to do with festivals was okay by me. And that included the Muslim festivals. Because even though we lived in a Christian, a missionary compound, a parsonage, as it was called, St. Peter's Parsonage, we had neighbors, Muslim neighbors, and the interaction between the two faiths was quite a normal, accommodative, communal kind of existence. not the kind of murderous nonsense you have these days, with religious extremists and so on. We celebrated with the Muslims their festivals, the Eid, the Ramadan, etc. Sometimes even observed part of their fast days. And then there were the traditional religionists, I said, and I learned very early of traditional deities, Yoruba, the Ogun, for instance, god of iron, the road, poetry, etc., Shango, god of lightning. I found the traditional religions far more fascinating. At least they didn't force me to go to regular service and dress up and things like that. It was more relaxed and more humanist in my view. But it didn't mean that I didn't like the other religions either. I was a member of the church choir quite early because I liked music, and in any case, as a son of the headmaster, who was also a deacon, and of course, my mother was a very passionate Christian. Used to go out evangelizing also. I was expected, to also be religious. Well, I had no problem with the choir. I loved singing, loved music, loved the sound of the organ, and even I enjoyed the processions during the seasonal days. But I never really took to religion as such. For me, religion was just another aspect. I couldn't, an aspect of the totality of one's existence. And I think I think my parents tried too hard. And so I rebelled quite early, and found myself more attuned to a comparative approach to religions. Comparative. There's a way in which a child is brought up in my society. The first thing is that a child is supposed to be a responsible member of the household. You had your duties and you had better carry them out. On the other hand, a child, as I said, was supposed to be seen, not heard. In fact, preferably neither seen nor heard. You took instructions and you made yourself available at all times for any kind of duties, extra duties that might be imposed on you. I had no problem carrying out duties. But somehow, as a child, I also had insisted on my own space. And sometimes I would go far to find that space, which we're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to leave the house without telling your parents where you were going or someone in the household. And I'm afraid I didn't take very kindly to over-restriction. And so one of the expressions which I remember I would get from my mother was, "You are too overconfident. You are overconfident. That's what your father always says to you. This overconfidence, and that's going to kill you one of these days." That kind of thing. But it made no difference. I just was where I was. And one found one had to sort of thread one's way through, on the one hand, the recognition in society of the individual stamp of every child. It's a paradox, because even in traditional religion, recognition is given to a child who, as you might say, as we say, has brought his own head into the world, or Morier, or his own as a personal head. But at the same time, it's not considered healthy for a child to be too individual. So you have to manage to manipulate your way through that. A child who appeared introspective was considered to be possible danger to himself or herself. An effort will be made to draw that child out of that child's habit of solitude, isolation. So I think it has to do with the very unique virtue in Yoruba society, this threading a balance between the social aspect of the child and a recognition of that unique individual characteristic of the child, but with the balance in favor of the social child. A child is not supposed to desert the community, and if too much of that sign is seen, then efforts are made to bring you out of it. If there's something wrong there. Now, I had to fight that as a child, and that led to accusations of, over self-confidence, that kind of thing. I would say it was that first teacher I had who admitted me into school, quite an unorthodox manner, Mr. Alagbaju. And he was, he not only encouraged, he was also a family friend. And this is it, you see, this, for instance, once I started going to school, sometimes I wouldn't go back to my own home. I just follow Mr. Alagbaju home. And then he might send a message that I'm with him and they shouldn't bother about me. So that also gave me some kind of independence, in addition to then getting to read Mr. Alagbaju's books and then pestering him with questions. So in that way, I formed quite a bond with Mr. Alagbaju and, of course, with his children. So that became a second home to me as I grew older. It was all over the town, and we felt it mostly. First of all, I listened to discussions over the phone between my auntie, Mrs. Ransom Kuti, and the district officer, the white European district officer, and he used to talk about the war. We had this crude hand-crank telephone, in those days. I think she had probably, that household had one of the few telephones in town. We certainly had none in my household. And I know they used to discuss it, and my parents, of course, my father in particular, secular friends. But I think the way we felt the impact most was when we were asked to, the whole town, bylaws were passed which compelled homes to black out during the night. And so you had to paint your windows or put drapes on, make sure no light came out. Then you had slogans like "Win the War," help win the war, and you were supposed to use and reuse an envelope, to save money for the war effort. Didn't fully understand what the war was all about, but we knew that there was one side which was good, the other side which was bad, and we had to help the good side win. There were little things like even barbers, hairdressers, use the opportunity to create win the war hairstyles, which appeared in their windows, win the war cut, tuppence, the other one, a bit more. And then there came news we were about 60 kilometers from Lagos, the capital. And of course, in Lagos, the anti-enemy preventive action was even stronger. And once there was an explosion in a ship, on board a ship in Lagos, and we got news about that. And then we really felt the war was coming very, very close. It wasn't actually German action, just an accident on a boat, but for us this was enemy action. And so we all got quite tensed up. And occasionally when a light plane flew overhead, we learned to associate that with the war effort. Then, of course, there were soldiers constantly being bussed from one side of the town to the other. We had Lafenwa barracks, and we had foreign soldiers who sometimes came through. So the war was very much a palpable event for us. We had the loudspeaker, and war news, there was a special section devoted to war news. I think it was over the radio I first heard the voice of Winston Churchill, who seemed to have been It was like a one, like a duel. In my childhood thing, it was like a duel going on between Winston Churchill and the other man called Adolf Hitler, and into which other people were roped. It began as a kind of middle class movement, one which tried to absorb the peasantry, the peasant women, the small time traders, and so on, into a low middle class kind of sensibility. And then it became more politically conscious, and as the women brought their problems, this is what we experience from the servants of the policemen of the king. These were called the Native Administration Police, and they were called the Akoda. And they used to waylay these women and tax them on the spot for goods they were bringing from the farms. So this kind of oppressive action was brought to these meetings for discussion. So these meetings became more and more politicized until focus was beamed on the ultimate traditional authority, the Alake of Abeokuta, the king, and his council of elders. And so I was able to experience the divide between the peasantry, the ordinary people, and the traditional rulers. That's on the one hand. On the other side, listening to the conversations and the disputes between my aunt and my uncle and the British district officers, political officers, I was able to recognize also the fact that the British government, this external authority, was also an instrument of oppression and was in fact alienated from the genuine aspirations and self-fulfillment of the overall society. So I had this in two directions, this dichotomy, this conflict of interests between one group, and the other group in authority. In traditional society, pre-colonial society, there was a levy towards the improvement of society, community levy during festivals, etc., etc. So these were traditional levies, and there was a way, a regular routine way of collecting these levies. They were not hardly ever resented. If a king went beyond his authority, he was soon deposed in one form or the other. Now, when the British came, then they brought their own levy. Capitation tax, poll tax, salary taxes on salaries. So there was an increase of the burden of extraction from regular earnings of people. And the worst part of it was that the traditional authority took the opportunity also to increase what used to be the regular accepted forms of taxation. And that taxation extended to taxation on crops, and they would collect it from women coming in, bringing their crops to the market. So in addition to, let us say, a market levy, which is traditional, markets have to be kept tidy, facilities have to be made. People never resented all of that. But now came the point where additional levies were being made on the actual goods being brought from the farms. And sometimes the women would be arrested, their goods seized completely. And finally, this movement of the women, self-improvement movement, spearheaded by my aunt, Mrs. Ransom Kuti, decided to take on both the district officers and the traditional king. This is what happened. We always came home on holidays. When I was in government college, Ibadan, always on holiday. At least 3 times a year, the Christmas holiday, the long break, and sometimes some holidays, in between special holidays, a long weekend. Now, I left for government college about before I was 11. So, I had to come home on holidays. But some holidays I did spend with our relations in Ibadan. And for me, going to government college was freedom, because I was, it's another phase in my life. And then when I left government college, I went to work in Lagos. I wanted to work first before going to college, to the tertiary institution. And I worked in the medical stores for a year and a half before going to college. I was always going to go to university. In fact, I should have gone earlier, straight from school, if my father had his way. But for us at the time, I left college. I left secondary school at a very early age. Before now it's nothing, but at that time to leave school at 16 and a half was a big deal. And my father wanted me to go straight to university. And I just felt I needed some experience of the world before going to college. And so I refused to take the exams the first year to to university college. I went straight to see my uncle in Lagos. He was a pharmacist. And if I wanted to get a job in a newspaper, I felt I wanted to be a journalist, a newspaper correspondent. But somehow we became compromised. They still felt I was too young to strike out on my own. But I left Abeokuta and insisted on being in Lagos, so I went to work at the pharmacy college, a pharmacy department. My uncle was the chief pharmacist, and eventually I was put in charge of a store, probably the youngest person ever to be in charge. It was rather interesting. I was in charge of what we call section called Section B. It was actually called the medical stores, the full complex, medical stores. The Section A was a pharmacy. Of course, nothing wouldn't go there. But Section B, I eventually became the head of that division. And we were sending things like dressing, catguts, surgical equipment to all corners of the nation. Bauchi, Lagos, Enugu, where the government hospitals were, Sudan Interior Mission, that's when I first came across expressions like that. And that was a missionary organization which had hospitals up north, and we'd fulfill their indents and would put them in bales and boxes, send them to the railway station for delivery. It was very heady stuff. But I came to that position of responsibility very, very early, and purely by accident. I was just another sort of clerical assistant in that store, and then something happened to the head of the store. Whether he was transferred or he left to go to study in England, and by default, I was the next senior, most educated person in that store. And so I stepped in there, and somehow I remained there. Even took a photograph, I remember, in my apron, telephone on the one side, very proud of that photograph. It's about just under 17. I wanted to earn some money first, quite frankly. I didn't want to go into college completely dependent on my parents, and also I wanted a scholarship again. They were ready even to, pay. My father was ready to pay, but I knew how much he was earning, and there were other children and so on. And I felt I'd be more secure in myself, and if I had some pocket money. So anyway, I had to sit the exam, got a scholarship, and so I went to University College, Ibadan. University life had always fascinated me. Maybe that's one of the reasons why I wanted to be quite mature, at least to develop some maturity before going to college. And I'd studied university culture, and I knew about fraternities, the fraternity culture in Germany, in the United States, in France, everywhere. And so when I went to college, that's the University College, Ibadan, and was shocked and rather, there was an elitist mentality about the first comers into the university stakes. Many of them were children of rich people, what we call the children of colonial aristocrats. And they brought that mentality of colonial aristocracy into a college setting. Totally divorced. They consider themselves divorced from the rest of the community. That sense of responsibility with which I grew up. It was just not there. And so they had these clubs, a number of clubs. There was the social club, for instance, all mimicking British, what they considered British culture, always dressed up in ties, jackets, and so on. The college atmosphere was modeled on Cambridge and so on. You went to dinner, high tea. You had to wear robes to go to dinner. I hated all that stuff. I didn't mind the occasional ceremonial, but to mimic British manners and so on was for me just ridiculous. And so we started as a rebellion against this staid British formalism. We started the Pirates' Confraternity. And one of its mottos was against moribund convention. And we used to dress as, rough and ready pirates. We used to sail, quote unquote, on top of a flat surface of the bookshop. I would climb up the bookshop. I would then knock off the ladder and sail into the horizon. It was all typical student fun. Unfortunately, in later years, mimic organizations began, which were rather nasty, complete debasement of the confraternity idea. No, I didn't finish there because the course I wanted to take was English literature, not just a general degree. By this time, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I hated mathematics. I had no time for physics or chemistry, even though I managed to struggle through. It was a struggle in school. But once that was done, I threw my books, all my mathematics books out of the window, concentrated on literature. And then when I was ready to go for the final years, the honors course in literature had not been started. And so my scholarship was extended to go to England. That's how I came to go to England. First of all, there was the fact that you were now totally independent. You're now fending for yourself, which is something I'd always wanted from childhood anyway. But then you were in a different culture with a lower sense of community, or maybe I should say with a sense of community diffused and more isolated kind of existence. You had to make new friends, you had to study the natives and see how you could fit yourself into it. You experienced also the racial discrimination, which was still very strong at the time, even though the British were very hypocritical about it. Even then, we tried to pretend it wasn't there, like other societies. And but then you gradually began to form your own community, which meant that during the holidays you went to work in places like Hull, Liverpool, London, where you then created, in the West African Students' Union, for instance, you had your own community. That's the main difference. From childhood, I'd always been interested in theatre. I used to gather my siblings and perform sketches based on stories, folk tales, and sometimes even improvised comic turns in which we mimicked the adults around us in their peculiar ways and so on. And then I took part in a school operetta quite early, very early. I took the lead part. It was called The Magician. So I'd always been, and around, as you already remarked, around me was theatre, different theatre forms. I was supposed to start working on my doctoral thesis, and but then after the first year, I found I was more. Again, I knew what I wanted to do, and somehow I wanted to write, and I sent a play to the Royal Court Theatre in London, and it was not immediately accepted for performance, but sufficient interest was generated for the artistic director, to invite me over. And so I spent most of my time just watching rehearsals, reading plays in London, instead of doing my thesis in Leeds. So I consider myself a doctoral dropout. I was trying to recapture certain features, community. We spoke earlier of the community. In the Swamp Dwellers, for instance, I was trying to capture a sense of community, which I'd known in Nigeria. And The Lion and the Jewel was also, again, it is a comedy, of course, and it was to capture the transition between traditional society, the concept of Western, quote-unquote, civilization, and trying to see the weaknesses in either. The things are not quite as... One was not necessarily progression on the other. This were just expressions of my own observations of society. At the beginning, there was a single-minded direction, which was independence. We had independence from the British. And so the nationalists were at the fore, negotiations were going on about independence. Groups came to London, Lancaster House meeting to discuss with the British Home Office, as it was called at the time. And eventually, in 1960, independence began. Unfortunately, the process into independence was flawed, because the British wanted to leave their surrogates behind, and the British, on their own admission later on, but this was evident even at the time. It's all coming out in the wash, of course. The Official Secrets Act ended. The British deliberately manipulated into a position of power a section that was more feudal in Nigeria, because they felt they would serve their own interests. They were not as radical as the southern part. And so the grounds were already laid for political dissension. Then later, oil was found. And then oil politics began to complicate matters even further. These waves of nationalists used to come for conferences to discuss independence in Nigeria. And I couldn't help observing that they were committed nationalists, but at the same time, you see, I always had, probably because of my background, elitism and privilege are subjects to which I respond confrontationally, immediately, because I really had ingrained in me this egalitarian principle and the sense of service. And I saw the first comers as being very, almost as if their basic motivation was to step into the shoes of the departing colonial officers, the British colonials. I saw them already positioning themselves to take over power. Power and privilege seemed to be more important to them than service and commitment to the community. Perhaps this will become even more understandable if you took into consideration the fact that I was already at that time, because of I was already heavily politicized. I was very acutely aware of what was happening in South Africa, the hardening of the South African apartheid system. In fact, my very first play in England was directed at apartheid South Africa, called The Invention. And a group of us, I spoke about this community, anytime during the holidays we come together, go to work to earn pocket money and sit down at the West African Union discussing politics, national politics, continental politics. And we were those who felt, we felt that our main mission, first mission, was to go and liberate South Africa. We had no doubt at all in our minds that this was our immediate mission. Now, this got derailed when, it's my cousin. This got derailed when we then encountered the first flag bearers of our national independence. And we said, we began to ask ourselves, shouldn't charity really begin at home? Isn't this the first line of concern we should have? Because I began to see them as potential internal colonialists. And of course, events have proved us right. So my attention became diverted towards Nigeria. And I couldn't wait to get back. And of course, I wrote A Dance to the Forests as a warning. Play that what we saw indicated quite clearly that we might have to fight the war of independence all over again, this time against our own leaders. So it is all this came about because of this politicization and a habit I'd developed of examining issues very carefully. In other words, not get carried away by slogans, but trying to see what lies behind the slogans, and how after one phase of struggle is ended, the next phase might have to be confronted. Penkele mess summed up for me the mess, the political mess into which we'd got ourselves. And it was an expression actually by one of the politicians, who's a great populist, by the way, very fascinating character, but representative of the corruption of the politicians at that particular time. And the Penkele mess years, I use that expression to describe the abortion of our expectations, the crudeness which accompanied politics, the violence, the ballot rigging, the violence which carried over even into the House of Assembly. The fissures had become quite open, had blown wide open. And so I virtually settled into the politics of Nigeria itself, which for me was sad. It was a sad recognition, even though it's just affirmation of what I had predicted, but it was still sad to find it coming to pass. So receding constantly was that vision of the entire continent marching down south to liberate South Africa, which I thought should have been our priority in the first place. And so I got that frustration from the two sides, frustration from a diminishing of that continental vision, because I saw Africa as one entity, and then a frustration about not being able to right the anomalies within my own society. And I got deeper and deeper involved in Nigerian politics. Colonial powers never really want to leave anyway. They leave only because they find they're either compelled to by war, direct militant action, or because they're clever enough to realize that they can maintain a continuing neocolonial linkage with their possessions by granting independence. But they keep the contact. And they do that by leaving their surrogates behind. And that's what the British did. They picked on the least progressive part of the country, falsified censors, falsified elections to make sure that when they left, they handed over power to them. I just got tired of going to the funerals of my colleagues and my students. The Ibadan-Ife Road, I named it Slaughter Slab. There's no day I would drive on that road when I didn't pick up. I didn't come across the first accident. I'd take the injured to the hospital or take them to the morgue. Just virtually no day. And each time I was teaching in Ife, then there'd be a new space in my classroom, lost to the road. So my most brilliant colleagues, one at least I can think of immediately, a brilliant medical doctor, surgeon, became a paraplegic as a result of spinal injury he sustained on that road. And finally I said, I'm tired of feeding heads with knowledge and then scooping up those brains on the road. Something has to be done. So I sat down and drafted a proposal for a kind of voluntary force made up of citizens, respectable, and knowledgeable citizens who would have, however, powers of education, discipline, and so on and so forth, complemented by a small, uniformed corps, which would educate and also, discipline people on the road. And so the idea grew, and people came from other states to come and learn, what we were doing, and went back to form the similar things. And eventually, when another military regime came, and the statistics went up because the politicians came in and virtually dissolved the Road Safety Corps. See, they didn't like the Road Safety Corps because we've talked about elections and corruption and so on. During the elections, the road they have to be free for elections to be rigged. It's a phenomenon, the connection between all of these. The thugs take over the roads. They're carrying fake ballot boxes from point A to point B. They're storing them. Some of them are also transporting fake military uniforms and guns and so on. And one of the first thing I taught my corps was to respect nobody on the road who committed any infringement, whether you were a judge, whether you were a soldier. That first thing is, on the road, everybody has got to be equal, which meant that the Road Safety Corps would stop these vehicles because they never even behaved. All they had to do was behave themselves on the road and get their, criminal material from A to B. But no, that was not enough. They had to show their power on the road to defy everything. And of course, they collaborated with the police. So the one organization which could and did many times prevent aspects of election rigging was the Road Safety Corps. The number of vehicles where we found stuffed boxes, fake ballot boxes, fake police uniforms, and we were able to track them to warehouses where all this illegal material was stopped. It was just too much for the political party in power. And so, when the next elections were approaching, they decided to uproot some kind of colonial law which arguably gave the right for official presence on the road to the Ministry of Works, Roads and Works of Transportation. And so Road Safety Corps all over the states were shunted off to one side. And of course, the statistics rose. So when the military came over, and they began to lose their soldiers by the score on the road, much more than on the battlefront, the military government appealed to me to please resurrect what we did in Oyo State on a national scale. So that's the story of the Road Safety Corps, my involvement with it. That was an interesting story. I was actually in the air flying. I was teaching in Cornell at the time, and I was on my way home and stopping in Paris for a meeting of the International Theatre Institute, whose president I was at the time. And so I was in my cousin's home, apartment. I arrived, and of course, the rumors had gotten very, very strong somehow. And he was very excited and tried to douse his enthusiasm. And he was working at UNESCO. I had a meeting in UNESCO that day. And he said, hadn't you heard? And I said, heard what? So I said, oh, Yemi, come on. These rumors are always flying around. Just relax, leave me alone. He said, no. This is quite serious. I said, Yemi, forget it. Nobel Prizes don't just drop in your lap like that. Let me sleep. And then a journalist came. He went to work. That's my cousin. But then he'd let in a journalist. Apparently, that journalist had been sent by the Nobel Academy. They always like to, if wherever possible, they like to send somebody physically to deliver the news. And or was it his newspaper? His newspaper sent him to try and catch me and find my reaction. That newspaper is a Swedish newspaper which tries to get the immediate reaction of the Nobel laureate. And so he came in and asked me. I said, "You too?" He said, "No, this is it. This is quite true." So, well, thank you very much. I'm going to sleep. I've just flown across the Atlantic, Dad. So I said, "But aren't you going to wait and hear the news?" I said, "What news?" He said, "No, it's going to be announced by such and such a time." I said, "Fine, I'm going to sleep." But the phone didn't allow me to sleep. So finally I gave up, made my coffee, offered this man some. And there he was going he switched on the television, switched on the radio, and he would go tune into the equivalent of a National Public Service, this posh station. And then there was a program also by Bernard Pivot, a cultural program. That morning, you go twiddle the thumb here. So I started drinking my coffee and reading newspapers. And at the end of the program, he said, "But they haven't announced it." And of course, I'd heard. So I enjoyed that moment, because he missed it while he was at the radio. I think Bernard Pivot, somebody came in with a piece of paper, handed it to Pivot. She looked at it and put it beside him. And then at the end of the program, he said, "Oh, the Nobel something had just been announced, and it's a Nigerian writer, Wole Soyinka." So the man finished. Said, "They didn't announce it." I said, "Announce what?" He said, "There's a Nobel Prize." They didn't. Oh, I said, They did. I said, "Who?" Yes. So I said, "Wole Soyinka." I said, "Well? Well?" I said, "Well, what?" I said, "Isn't that what you came for?" I said, "Yeah, but..." I said, "What do you want me to do? Get out the drums and start drumming or singing or faint or what? What do you want exactly?" I said, "But why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Well, you didn't ask me. I should call you. If it was announced, you were busy all over the place." That's how I heard about it. I enjoy that moment, actually, at the expense of the journalist. As I confessed early, my political orientation was very much South Africa bound, very heavily so, obsessively so. Even to the extent that I undertook military training. I registered my officer in Okade at Leeds University because, like a group of us, we felt that this was our mission to liberate Southern Africa. I wrote my first play. Well, not my first play, one of my earliest plays, The Invention, which is staged at the Royal Court Theatre, on the situation in South Africa. So Mandela, of course, came to symbolize, for me, as for most of the world, the struggle in South Africa, which is inevitable that I should dedicate it to him. Many people outside my own country are closer to me in spirit and, as far as I'm concerned, in blood, than many who pretend that they're leaders in my own country. Some of them, as far as I'm concerned, dropped from Mars. So I don't have any kind of what you might call basic patriotism. I like it. I like it completely. I recognize communities. I'm very glad we spoke of communities. I recognize communities as being close to me. I'm a member of a certain community which is both internal, which happens to be located in the nation space called Nigeria, but that community also extends outside the Nigerian borders. And that community, as far as I'm concerned, is without color, without gender, without class. All those details for me are irrelevant, and they are my family, wherever they are. So Nigerian, why shouldn't I dedicate my Nobel speech to Nigeria? Nigeria is just, for me, a figure of speech. When, despite all obstacles placed in their way, the Nigerian people trooped out in the most disciplined manner you can imagine and registered their votes. And it was annulled as the announcements were being collated and so on and so forth. It was annulled. And of course, the people rose in protest, and I was again, involved in some of the protestations and witnessed the brutality of the military and the police during that time. And since then, Nigeria has not had one credible election. Everything has been manipulated. And so we had years and years of waste even after the brutal military dictatorship. We'll be haunted, Nigeria will remain haunted by that day for another generation to come. I'm convinced of that. The international community can only play a peripheral role. Symbolic and at the same time actual. For instance, Obama's travel to Ghana, his first visit to Africa, when he deliberately bypassed Nigeria, and one which we have played up, to emphasize that Nigerians do not miss the significance of that gesture. So things like that, the isolation of a nation which refuses to treat its people like equal citizens, which constantly deprives them of their voices, which brutalizes them in many ways, extrajudicial killings, repression, misuse of state power, the army. By the international community can constantly, directly or indirectly, sanction such nations. And where crimes against humanity have been committed, place the names of the perpetrators after they make their own inquiries, which is never difficult, all the facts are there. Place the principals under interdiction, ban them, and most especially the most egregiously corrupt. Make sure they cannot come into their countries to enjoy their loot. Collaborate with the non-governmental organizations in supplying information as to where the loot is, so that it can be recovered for the country. And also open their doors, as, for instance, a number did during the struggle against Sani Abacha, the most brutal dictator Nigeria has ever known. Open their doors to genuine refugees, not try and, hassle them further with rejection, or with bureaucratic red tape. Demanding, it's sometimes, some of these countries behave as if you need to bring your death certificate by extrajudicial execution before you're admitted as a refugee, as a political refugee. Sometimes these governments can be so obtuse. So a more openness towards the genuine dissidents in other countries. Those services, external services, are quite sufficient to enable those whose principal concern it is, the dissidents within the country themselves, to take action necessary to relieve themselves of oppression. No. The oil situation, in fact, there's a low-key civil war going on at the moment, which may be coming to an end, I think. But that's been more localized. It's been this contest over resources. The protest of the people of the oil-producing region about neglect, about the degradation of their normal organic production system, their farms, their fishing ponds, and so on, over which a writer has also lost his life. He and his companions, Ken Saro-Wiwa, who were hanged by, and his 8 companions, who were hanged by Sani Abacha, that brutal dictator I mentioned earlier. So that kind of insurgency is still going on at this moment. But a full-scale civil war, well, I hope it's unlikely. Well, first of all, people in the country were not taking HIV/AIDS seriously. My cousin was Minister of Health under Babangida, who came, and that was before Abacha, because Abacha came after Babangida. And during that period, the government was not taking HIV/AIDS seriously. And so when I was approached, my son was involved in this particular film, by the way, and he suggested it. I accepted immediately because I felt somebody with quote-unquote a high profile might have some impact on people, and get them to be a bit careful. Within Nigeria, we'd lost a number of people, even the cause of death not publicly acknowledged. I can't remember. My cousin, of course, Fela Ransom Kuti, Anikulapo Kuti, the son of my uncle, the Reverend Ayo Ransom Kuti, whom I mentioned earlier. He died of AIDS. And so it was time for public awareness on any possible augmentation, because some of it was already going on. And that's why I agreed to do that. Most exciting moment, I assure you it was not the Nobel thing. I know many people think a prize like that should count, but no, not at all. I would say if I've directed a play on stage and I see the excited face of my company, when they really feel they've pulled off something, and I've also got the same vibrations from the audience, I think that's when I really feel very fulfilled. I call theatre the most socialized form of literary expression, simply because it involves people all the time, and there is a kind of dynamic which exists in the theatre which you do not find by reading a book or reading a poem. Different sensibilities completely. I mean, reading a novel is almost it's an individual exercise. Even when unless you take it to the stage and you're doing an open reading, poetry is even more personal, more intimate. Theatre is where the community expresses itself most directly. However, when I want to raise political consciousness, awareness, sensitize the people, I use the form which I call the guerrilla theatre. I formed a small group, a very tight group, when I returned after the large 1960 masques, which dealt, if you like, with mainstream theatre. I found I needed a smaller, tighter group which could take a theme, current theme, improvise around it, and perform in the marketplace, on the lawns, in front of civil service headquarters, outside the House of Assembly, any open space, as well as in the theatre, hitting directly at unacceptable conduct events with recognizable, mimicking, acting, recognizable individuals and pillorying power, government, and so on. Now that is directed, without any ambiguity at people at direct situations. But generally, a theme preoccupies me, and I write a play around it. I don't think I ever doubted my ability, for the simple reason that if I'm doing something, if I'm working on something and it's not working out, then I just leave it alone and can do other things. I've so many interests, and I know there are a number of other things I would have wanted to be, for instance. I know that I've been very passionate about architecture. I would have loved to be an architect. I also consider myself a failed musician. I would love to be a musician, at least to spend more time with music and so on. So I have interests, and so I do not see them as anything I'm working on is just something I'm working on, and it may work, it may not work. And as I said, I just do other things if it's not working. I think it's up to people to decide what they want to extract from what I've done or left undone. But the advice I always give to my young children or to young writers or those who want to be activists in some way, who come to me and say, what should we do about this situation? How can we contribute? I just say, follow your instincts. Don't feel you have to follow the paths of others, because you may not be temperamentally fitted for it, and so you'll just harm yourself and your cause and others. But just follow your instinct and don't ever pretend to be what you're not. It is impossible to quantify, but there's no question whatsoever that people are looking at the United States as, for a change, as a space of opportunity for its own self-fulfillment. See, the United States had garnered a lot of goodwill, international goodwill, and then frittered it away over the years, frittered it away like that. So people are looking at the United States, looking at this country, say, oh, so this is possible within the United States, then maybe other things are possible. And I think the kind of rigid, automatic hostility towards the United States in many parts of the world is beginning to sort of fray around the edges. People looking at the United States willing to give her a second chance. And Obama's ascension to power there is certainly going to alter also certain policies, certain global policies. There has been reflex action against the United States. Anything that the United States does, especially in the third world, in the Middle East and so on, it's that you should take the opposite direction, because there's something sinister lurking in the U.S. position. It's, even if people cannot analyze it, they say it's there, and so better go a different way. Well, all that I know is changing quite a lot. The only continent which may find itself out on a limb, and I keep telling my associates that, is the continent of Africa itself. For those who feel that Barack Obama, because it has some African ancestry, therefore will make Africa his priority, for me, this is foolish thinking. Why should he? He's an American. And there are certain pressing issues all over the world. And I think he's intelligent enough to give to the African continent just a proportionate share of the attention, which is commensurate with the condition of the world. I have a feeling that he's going to be very even-handed.